Hey G2, hope you're well. My name is Luke, and today we're going to be talking on Matthew 15, 1 to 20. We've been doing Matthew for yonks, haven't we? We've been in it for ages. That's just to keep reminding us that the reason why we're doing that is because we want to spend a long time going slowly through the Jesus story, through the Jesus narrative. Because as a church, like loads of churches, we're not on our own in this, but as G2, we want to be really focused on the person of Jesus and getting back to who he is and what he did, who he stood for, and how he's invited us into his story. So that's why we're spending a long time going through the Gospel of Matthew. And today it's Matthew 15, 1 to 20. What I suggest is, in a minute, I'll say press pause and then read it together in your group. The reason I want you to do that, after you've read it, I'd like you to not get into a massive debate at that stage. So there's going to be plenty of time for the big debates. That's such a great part of small group. You're going to have space to share your opinions and whatever. But if in our small group, you might be different, but in our small group, we often read the passage together, then have a massive debate, and talk it all through, share our opinions, and then we press play and watch the rest of the teaching, and then we all go, oh yeah, maybe that we should have watched that first. Makes a bit more sense. Now that doesn't mean I've got all the answers. I don't think that for a minute, but it would just the stuff I share might help to shape the discussion that you then have. So, Matthew 15 verses 1 to 20. There's plenty of spice in there. Jesus kicks off with the Pharisees. The disciples need a bit of help figuring it out. And there's some pretty central teaching to what God's mission is all about in there as well. So Matthew 15, 1 to 20. Can I suggest you get one person in your group to read that out? Then don't get into the discussion. Get back to this and press play, and then I'll set you off on more discussion after that. Is that all right? So come back to me as soon as you've read your thing. Okay, go. Okay, so that's a bit of a funny one. If anything like me, first time I read it, I was like, huh? There's a bit of confusion, and that's certainly what's going on for the disciples. They're like, hang on, just say that again. He's already explained something to the crowds and the disciples still don't get it, so they need it again. So you're in good company if you find that a bit of a weird passage. So here's bits of detail that might help you. Firstly, we know that the Pharisees are out to get Jesus. The reason we know that is because from the previous passage, we know where he was, and it says that they have come from Jerusalem. So they've come to find Jesus from Jerusalem. That's quite a long way. They've done a reasonably big travel in order to get to him. And they're teachers of the law, the Pharisees, so they wouldn't normally go out their way for a random rabbi who's just spouting a load of nonsense. So they obviously think that he can do some damage, and they think that we need to nullify this fella. So let's find him, seek him out, and try and trip him up. So that's the first thing to notice. That's the context of where they're coming from. And they say, now, let's read it here. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? Why don't they wash their hands before they eat? So on first reading, you could think that they're accusing him of breaking God's law, that he's like not scriptural, he's not followed the Torah, that they're claiming that sort of thing. That's not what they say. They say you're breaking the tradition of the elders, which is different in terms of not washing their hands before they eat. Now, whether or not it's a good idea for the disciples to wash their hands before they eat, we certainly try and get our boys to wash their hands before they eat, and we do as well. And, particularly in the old COVID times, it's been good to wash your hands a lot, right? This isn't a discussion about whether it's good to wash your hands or not. They're saying that there's a tradition of the elders that's being broken. It's almost like a religious practice, which the disciples are not fulfilling. It is true that in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, there are all sorts of rules and regulations that go beyond the Ten Commandments as to what you should do in certain times. And there is scriptural laws from the Old Testament about washing of hands, but it's to do with what priests should do. Priests need to wash their hands before they go in to do holy duties in the synagogue or the temple. There's guidance for priests as to how they should wash their hands, but that doesn't apply to every person in the world. So the Pharisees have brought in some new legislations that need to be adhered to, which are not God's laws, they're man's laws, but the Pharisee tradition has brought up these kind of things, and they're saying everyone now must wash their hands before eating. So that's a human rule, not a God rule, and that's what they're accusing Jesus of breaking. So that's important. These guys, the Pharisees, loved rules. They loved laws. Their theology was, if we can just get everyone to not sin for 24 hours, the Messiah will come back. Again, that's not something that you find in the Bible, but that's something that they had developed in their traditions. And they're like, we need to uphold the law of God. And if we can do that, then Jesus will come back. Oh, sorry, not Jesus. They didn't think it was him. The Messiah will return, and then there will be salvation for everyone. But in order to do that, in order to not sin for 24 hours, that's a problem if you've got people like lepers or Gentiles who are in permanent states of sin, in their view. They're just like, these people just are sinful just because of who they are. If you were born outside of marriage, for example, then you'd be deemed to just be a sinful person. There's nothing you can do, right? So they would exclude those people. So the Pharisees' whole tradition was around excluding certain people, narrowing down who are the real Jews, like they're serious players who absolutely can be pure, and if we can just get them to not mess up. So in order to do that, they're making rules all over the place, like human rules, to barrier out a load of people. They say you are not even included in that. So human rules to exclude. That's what the Pharisees were doing. Jesus comes in the opposite spirit to this. This is not what he's come with, God's rules, to get rid of man's rules that like exclude, but to include. So he's constantly saying, I have sheep in other pastures. I have not just come for these people, but there are other people that will also come to me. The whole mission and message of Jesus is inclusive and not exclusive. He breaks all sorts of boundaries and barriers and taboos and whatever to touch people that are unclean, to cleanse people who they wouldn't have gone near, the Pharisees wouldn't have gone near. So the Pharisees and Jesus are like absolutely at loggerheads. They're completely different messages that they've got for the people. So this is what Jesus replies to them. And why do you break the command of God? So notice that he doesn't address their accusation or their question. He doesn't say, well, it's because it's not in the Bible. It's not in the Torah. That's why we don't wash our hands before we eat. He doesn't even acknowledge their question with an answer. He just gives another question back, which is, and why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? Now, this tradition he's getting at is a really interesting one. The whole social justice system of the Old Testament, the way it's set up was that you would look after the older people, that you would the whole message of God in the Old Testament as well was that you would look after the vulnerable, the weak, widows, orphans, that it's in his heart for justice. He would measure us by how we look after those who are in need. Okay, so that's like Jesus is coming in with this context that that's where God has always come from, his Father. And this social justice system is set up that Jewish people would look after their elderly relatives, their mother and father, and that's what it means. It says, honor your mother and father. It doesn't just mean always, bite your tongue and don't tell them that they're annoying sometimes or ever challenge them or anything. It means honor them by looking after them so that, because there was no such thing as pensions or old people's homes or whatever like that. So you had to look after your elderly relatives. The Pharisees brought in this new tradition, this new law, again, man's law, that they've brought in to say that all your worldly wealth, all your houses, your possessions, your property, your money, everything that you've got, if you want, you can tithe that to the church. You can give it to the church in advance. So you can sign it away and say, everything I own, all of my stuff, like in a will, it can all go to the church. It's like signed away. And when I say church, I mean, it's the temple, the synagogue, the Jewish teachers of the law and their equivalent of church. It obviously wasn't called that then. So you can sign that away to them, but you don't have to give it now. You only give it on your death. So in the rest of your life, you can spend it on you. So the reason the Pharisees did that is because people knew these people aren't going to want to give their money now to the church, but when they're dead, who cares? But you know what they're not going to want to do is spend a load of money trying to look after the in-laws. So instead of that, let's set up a system where they can spend it now, but whatever's left, the church gets. So even if they died early, the elderly relatives are still screwed. So this completely messes up this whole social justice system, which has worked and is God's heart for protection of the vulnerable. So the Pharisees are going the opposite spirit to that, and they're saying, no, give it to us. You can be selfish and spend it on whatever you want when you're alive, and then we'll get the capital when you're dead. And the old people can just sort themselves out. So clearly this riles Jesus, and he wants to go in the opposite spirit to that. So he says to them, you hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. Imagine Jesus saying to you, Isaiah was right when he spoke about you. These people will honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Okay, so let's press pause now and you discuss. Did you find it interesting? Does that shed a little bit more light onto these things, the questions that Jesus and the Pharisees are asking each other? Is there anything you want to share from that? Anything's come up from that for you? And if you get to it, here's a question. Do you think you follow any earthly rules, any sort of like human rules, more vehemently than God's rules? So if you even just think about the 10 Commandments, is there any in there that you just think, yeah, I probably don't adhere to that? Like coveting, being jealous, that sort of stuff. Is that maybe there's not too many murderers in your small group. If there is anything that comes up about murdering someone, then maybe that takes it to a different zone, doesn't it? But if there's something else that in the commandments even that you think, yeah, I don't really stick to that well. But there's other rules which people get very tight about that are human rules. And what we've seen in the pandemic is a good example of that, isn't there? Without getting into the rights and wrongs of it and looking to start a COVID discussion, we can all agree people have got very passionate about earthly man-made rules, which are there for a perfectly good reason, and probably care more about that at certain times than God's law. So have a discussion about that and then press play when you're ready, and we'll do another 5 minutes. Okay, so the next bit is all about what comes into the mouth, not defiling, but actually what comes out of the heart. The source of the source of sin, basically. So the Pharisees are transfixed on the idea that if you're not washing your hands, if you're eating this, if you're eating the wrong thing, if you're drinking the wrong thing, if you do it at the wrong time, what goes into you is what makes you sinful. And Jesus' whole thing is saying to them, no. All of the earth is God's and everything in it, and it's good. So if you eat something, that's not going to make you dirty. It might make you unwell, but it's not going to make you sinful. But the heart is the source of sin. The heart is a human sin factory. Out of that flows all the dirtiness and whatever else. So it's from there that you can sow dirt that is going to breed more unhealth and sin in the rest of the world. So the question is, what is going on in your heart? That's really what Jesus is trying to ask here, and what he's trying to get into. I love this little bit, by the way. Those of you who know me well won't be surprised that I love this little bit. But it says, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. Those are two different things, aren't they? Listen and understand. How well are you listening to what Jesus is saying here? He knows there's people who are listening, and they are listening with a lens or a filter. They aren't understanding. So he's like, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. Then the disciples came to him and asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? Oh, I just think that's such a funny thing for them to have asked. Are you aware, Jesus, that the Pharisees have become offended by hearing your teaching? Poor Pharisees. Jesus replied, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, they will both fall into a pit. So he's like, honestly, I don't know how clear I can make it. These guys are false prophets. They're not to be listened to. They are going to lead to ruin. Their rules, their earthly ways, their man-made, human-made rules are a pile of junk, and they don't lead anywhere good. They are going to lead you into a pit. And he is not in the least bit bothered about offending people. You could have a discussion in your group about how willing you are to offend other people by preaching Jesus, by speaking about him, by just even talking about the truths that are in the Bible, because they offend people. The gospel is offensive. And if we currently live in a world where people's biggest fear is the fear of offending others, then we've got a massive problem, because the gospel is offensive. It stinks to most people. It's the aroma and nectar of Christ to others. So probably have to get used to the idea that some people are going to be offended when they hear what we have to say. So that's maybe a bit of an aside, but you could go into that with your discussion if you like. So Peter said, I'm grateful for Peter because he always asks the stuff that everyone's thinking, or at least certainly stuff I'm thinking. Peter says, explain this parable to us around the blind guides, the blind leading the blind. He's like, the blind lead the blind. I don't get it. Explain it to me. Jesus is like, okay, are you still so dull? Jesus asked them. An ego shrink happens at that moment when Jesus says, are you still so dull? Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? Whatever you think is unholy, you're going to basically eat it, digest it, and it's going to come out the other way. There's no need to go into any more graphic details than that. But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. These are what defile a person, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. Again, he's getting back to God's heart is for your, God's care is for your heart. And he wants you to be able to see there is nothing you can do. You are going to have evil thoughts. So you need rescue from that. The human condition is irrescuable without Jesus. It needs a salvation. And that's why Jesus is necessary. If you can fix that by behaving well, by good behavior and trying to be nice the whole time, or just trying desperately not to sin, then there is no purpose for Jesus. The other day I was playing on our golf course, playing with a guy who used to be a captain at Fulford, which is my golf course, and he is a guy who goes to church. And the interesting thing is, I reckon I've got more in common with most members who are not Christians than this guy who goes to church. We had a conversation around what it means to be a Christian, and I knew a bit about his thoughts around church and God already. So I decided I'm going to use the name of Jesus quickly and see what happens. So I said, in my job as Fusion, we work with all sorts of denominations and types of churches, but the main thing is really want students to be able to meet Jesus. And he said, yeah, that's interesting about Jesus. He says, I once had an argument with someone which went on for a very long time, because I said, in order to be a Christian, you don't really need Jesus. What you need is to follow the rules that are in the Bible. He says, look at the 10 Commandments and tell me if you don't like any of them. And the guy said, well, I do like all of them. And he says, well, you're a Christian then. This guy says, I'm not a Christian because I don't believe that Jesus was God, and I don't believe he died and rose again. So I'm not a Christian. And this guy says, you are a Christian because you want to follow the good rules that God has put in place for how the world should work. That's what Jesus is trying to lance in this particular passage. He's like, that is not true. You cannot act your way into heaven. You can't behave your way into the kingdom of God. You can't be good enough. You can never do that, because out of the human heart comes sin. We are always going to be sinful. We always need forgiveness and mercy. Every single human ever. So there's nothing we can do to get away from that. What we can also do is be disciplined around what we allow to come out of the mouth, because there's stuff which will happen in our thought life that will stir up from our heart, slander or envy or whatever. The question is, what do we lend our words to? So have a chat in your group, and you can finish on this. In what way were you stirred when I was speaking just then around the heart? Perhaps you thought, I don't agree. I think you don't I don't know if you always need forgiveness. Maybe there's something around what I said around sin always coming from the human heart that you didn't relate to, or maybe you did. Maybe there's something where you've realized, I need Jesus' forgiveness all over again. And you want to talk in your group and maybe say to the person next to you, can you just pray? I want to just give my life back to Jesus all over again, or maybe for the first time. And then can I suggest that you pray for each other at the end and thank God for how good he is, that he knew, even though we were far off, sent his son Jesus to rescue us from our own desperation for human rules and to try and act well and nicely, but instead to come and rescue us, to be with us, and to cleanse us from everything that is going to defile us, to free us from human rules, and to bring us into the kingdom of heaven with him. Have a good discussion. See you later.